Hey, church family, Pastor Dave Mergens here with this week's sermon reflection. Now, you heard me talk all about on Sunday contending for the faith, and really how significant it is in a time like now when we have a lot of conflict going on in our culture and our society. So, I want to dive into Acts chapter 17 and talk about how Paul's experience with this was a very real experience in the sense that he stepped right into a midst of a conflict situation, but he pointed people towards Jesus. But before I go there, I want to share with you about my favorite camp game. Now, I've been a youth pastor for a lot of years. I've been a camp speaker. I've done some of those things in my past. And one of my favorite games to play at camp was Steal the Blanket. Now, this sounds terrible, but this is what we did. We'd have a huge blanket in the middle of a field, students lined up on either side, and we would run in and pull the blanket to see who could get it over to their side of the field. Now, this was basically a large tug of war. And one of the things that I learned in experiencing this game was the only way that it's a battle is if you pick up the other end of the blanket. And as we are going through so much right now, I just want to encourage you, don't pick up the wrong blanket this season. There are battles that we ought to fight as followers of Jesus Christ, and that is for the faith. So be careful with which blanket you try to snatch. So let's look here at what Paul does in Acts chapter 17. So in Acts 17, we have Paul, who is sent ahead to Athens, waiting for Silas and for Timothy. And the text says this in verse 16. Now, while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw the city was full of idols. Now, I don't know about you, but there are a lot of things that stir up my spirit as well. And Paul, human like any of the rest of us, walked into a situation in a city that was filled with something that really stirred him up. And in this case, it was the idols. Now, what was his response? And this is really important because when we do get provoked, we ought to pay attention to how we respond. And so what does Paul do? Well, he began sharing Jesus with them. He began talking about the good news of Jesus Christ, preaching Christ and him crucified and the resurrection, which caused a stir because the people in Athens started to question, well, what is this new teaching Paul's talking about? What's going on here? So they invited him to go to the Areopagus, which was a large outcropping of rocks in Athens, Greece. And this particular Areopagus, and the only one in Greece, was the one where they spent time talking about new ideas, where they basically dedicated their entire lives, the people who were there, to just discussing and knowing and learning. And it was also a court setting, so they would try people there for crimes that they'd had. And so Paul was in a very formal setting where he was invited to share about the new teachings that he was bringing to the people of the city. So Paul, again, provoked in his spirit, what does he do? Well, he doesn't fight him about the idols. He brings Jesus Christ. And then he gets invited to the Areopagus, and here's what he does and says. So in verse 22, Paul says this. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, To the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. This is a beautiful rhetoric by Paul. He begins a sermon not to make the people feel bad about their idol worship, but he begins to make a bridge between their religious behavior in worshiping false idols and false gods to connecting that to the true God, specifically by saying there's this unknown God that is there among you, and I want to proclaim who that person is. And then he launches into an entire explanation of Jesus Christ. It's beautiful to watch how Paul does this. And I just want to encourage you that you know it is our responsibility as followers of Christ to be Christ's ambassador. And that when we encounter people and when our spirit gets stirred up and provoked, that we ought to have the light of Christ in our lives to show to those who are around us. Now, I don't want you to feel responsible for the outcome of what happens afterwards. Because even in this story, all right, you would think, well, yeah, Paul converted everyone there, right? Great story. He's an excellent preacher, communicator. I mean, he's one of the apostles. He met Jesus Christ on the road to Damascus. This guy should be able to win an entire audience. Well, he didn't. In fact, if you go on to verse 32, it says this. Now, when they heard the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, But others said, "We will hear you out again about this." So Paul went out from their midst, but some men joined him and believed. You see, our main task as followers of Jesus Christ is to share the gospel when our spirit's provoked like this. And the responsibility of the Holy Spirit is to convict individuals to then follow God. So if somebody who you share Jesus Christ with in grace and truth decides, you know what, this just isn't for me, that's not on you, that's on them. They're making the decision, not you. Our responsibility is to share it. And so I want to close with some other words from Paul. And he says this in Ephesians chapter 4. He says, "I, therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you've been called." So walk equal to your calling. Verse 2, "With all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you are called to the one hope that belongs to your call, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and is in all." And so God calls us to the unity of the Spirit. He calls us to proclaiming his good news by going according to the call that we've been called to, and to do so with grace, with humility, and to do so with eagerness. So I pray for you that as a church, we are eager to share the gospel of Jesus Christ in a way that is filled with grace and is humble before others and before God. Pray that you guys have a great week.